Well, it's good to be back again with Alex and Adam. We're continuing our journey through the grand narrative of Scripture and pulling that thread of marriage to see how does marriage really show up in all of the Bible? What can we learn from all of the Scripture? What can we see from the big plot of God's story about marriage, as opposed to cherry picking or looking or just having a few topical verses that oftentimes leave us, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Wanting. Wanting is the only, leaves us wanting. That's all I can think about. Frustrated and just with an incomplete understanding in view. And with that, I think missing a lot of the beauty from beginning to end in what God has to say about marriage. So we've already spoken about prologue, and what we've really just said about the prologue is that we acknowledge that there is a wise and loving God who has authored and created marriage. He's the creator of the entire universe, but in this series, we're also acknowledging that we have this wise, all loving God who has designed marriage. And then in his design for marriage and creation, last episode, we talked about how God designed marriage to be good as both an institution and as an experience for us. And for our spouses. And today we're going to venture into the fall. And I think one of the important things to remember about the fall, which is laid out for us in Genesis 3, is just the idea that I think a lot of times we come into our conversations about sin talking about how bad sin is. And sin is bad. But I think what the fall also tells us is that sin is harmful and hurtful. That in the fall we see this complete fracturing, that we are fractured from our relationship with God, even how we view ourselves completely is fractured and changes, and then of course how we relate to other people as well. And so yes, sin is bad, but it also hurts. And we want to be sensitive to that even today as we talk about the fall and sin, because we know that among our listeners there are different marriages represented, some that are experiencing a lot of the goodness already of the design of marriage, but others that are very much living in the fall as they are in difficult and even sometimes destructive relationships. But before we get started, last episode 2, we shared something good about our marriages. And I thought it might be fun to share something hard, because we're calling this basically like the fall. What is hard? This is where we are in the story. What is hard? So I started with Alex last time. Adam, can I start with you this time?
Sometimes it is really difficult to go back and consider some of the more challenging seasons. But, as we've wrestled with this material, one thing that was kind of stuck out for me was really for 8 years of our marriage, we really developed some pretty bad communication patterns in many ways. Our personalities, just maybe family of origin, a lot went into it, but I didn't realize how much it affected us, until we really kind of came to some places of really needing help and counseling, but just realizing, it's really some small things that all added up to some big things, and really just communication where we're not seeing some of what we talked about in that last podcast about the goodness and valuing the other and hearing the voice and the agency of the other. And so, as I look back, one of the places where I think about the fall impact on our marriage was just the realm of communication.
That's good. I think a lot of people could relate to that. What about you, Alex?
I think I'm going to maybe take it in a different direction, but I think we've had two maybe big topics or areas that have been hard for us in marriage. And one, of course, I've talked about on here a lot is my journey with chronic pain. And then for Mason, it's really been running a small business. And we had we've had certainly long, hard seasons in that, and there's a lot of dailiness in it, like just a lot of the daily struggle of how do we stay connected, how do we keep fighting for our marriage in the midst of what feels like it just wears you down in the dailiness of the hard. And so I think Mason likes to say that we have learned how to appreciate small things because of it, and I certainly think that's true. But that was born out of just having a lot taken away, and from me with pain, from him through the business, and having to learn how to do that. And there's certainly many years where that was not easy.
I love the two illustrations you gave. They're so different.
Oh.
And I'm going to just layer on top of that, because I think the hard that Paul and I experienced points to a difference in our personality, but also revealing something about a sin struggle in us. And I've said before that Paul and I are very different. I mean, talk about marrying your opposites. We really did. And so, and interestingly enough, I mean, I married this guy who was the most godly guy that I'd ever known. And then I cried all the time my first year of marriage because he constantly hurt my feelings. And of course, he was in shock. He didn't know what to do with that. But Paul is very much, and I would say very much was, because he softened so much. And now I have, redemption has come, and we'll talk more about that. Maybe when we get there, I'll say how this is kind of what the Lord has done. But in the earlier stages of our marriage, he was very conflict oriented. I was very avoidant. He was very direct. I was very indirect. And his besetting sin was really a desire for control, like to be in control and to have control. And mine was peace at all cost. And so, as you can imagine, that just created a lot of hardship. I'm going to say, especially for me in the marriage, because it was a lot easier.
Because I'm telling the story.
That's right. That's right. It's my story, and I get to tell it the way I want to. It was really hard for me. I think he would say it was hard for him, but part of what happened in the heart is because I kept responding to him, not doing the good created design where I would be that force that would actually push against his control. And continue to give into my people pleasing. It just allowed him to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in the marriage, and I got smaller and smaller and smaller in the marriage. And so I think a big part of the redemption story in our marriage is how that got turned around, because you can't have a good friendship, much less a good marriage, with those sort of dynamics going on. So, okay, well, we are dead center in the fall on this episode. And we want everybody to know you are in good company. This is why we share just a sampling of the hard or the bad or the ugly in our marriage. But Alex, we just talk about how the fall, of course, just came and distorted so many things. But one of the first things it distorted was just this good design for marriage. What do we mean by that?
Well, one of the things I wish we had said in the last episode is that what creation calls us to do is give honor and delight to one another, to the Lord. And so what happens in the fall is that instead of giving honor and delight to the good design in ourselves and to our spouse, we end up using that God-given design to consume and destroy what he created. And those are really big, heavy words, but I think they're meaningful. I think they're helpful when we see how sin begins to affect our relationships, how it breaks down intimacy. And so consume and destroy is what the fall is all about, I think. And so we're going to just start with the story of the fall. I'm going to read the scriptures and let Adam kind of break that down and just show the way that the fall has affected marriage. We're going to read Genesis 3, 7 through 12. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" And the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate."
Clear as day, the woman did it.
There it is.
It is so. It's hard for us to. Sometimes even in our culture, we think the way that we deal with what is hard is almost to ignore the truthfulness of the hard or the foundations of it, and we try to almost cover it with other things. And we actually see that in this text as it goes further too. But what happens is when sin enters the world, immediately all the relational dynamics change. First vertically, like their relationship with God is broken. It is altered because of this choosing something other than God. Like sin at its core is just not God. It isn't just breaking a command. It's breaking the heart of the lawgiver, of choosing something other than God, as we again talked about starting in the prologue with God himself. So the relational dynamic with God has changed, with each other has changed. You immediately see Adam and Eve like bolt, to hide from the other, where that image of was naked and unashamed, we have the first experience of humanity experiencing shame in this, where suddenly there's this feeling of something's not okay between me and you, and I've got to hide, I've got to distance, and I've got to cover up. I've got to somehow protect against you really seeing me. And so that dynamics change, which in turn also tells us our relational dynamic with self is actually changed here. That inability to feel safe with the other, that inability to really offer ourselves to the other person is actually broken, as well as Adam and Eve distance. So what you have is that idea of hiding, of blaming, them beginning to say, like, the woman you gave me, Lord, she did it. And then, it's going down the line, a serpent did it, so there's this blaming, this destruction of behavior, even with one another. And again, so really the beauty of every aspect of creation is distorted here. And distorted is a really important word because it's not demolished in the sense of eradicated. Like Adam and Eve are still like, we still look human, we still bear the image of God, but our desires have been distorted, have been twisted. And as Alex used the word shalom, that idea of not just peace in the sense of absence of conflict, but of wholeness. Dan Allender says here is where shalom is shattered. That's the great offense of the fall, is that the peace God intended in his design of us to experience with him, with each other, and even in our making has all been shattered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you were talking, Adam, I was just thinking about, you were using the word blame, a lot. There's blaming. And then in marriage, so often we see the minimizing of sin or even the denying. And so there's shame. And then because of the shame, there's actually no ability to come and be honest about what's happened. And so it's just like the sins just keep mounting up and keep fracturing and fracturing. It's kind of a snowball's effect. And another thought I had, Alex, when you were using the words consume and destroy, that this is, what happens when we get out of God's design and when sin is unleashed in our marriage, and we don't have Jesus or the picture of redemption or life coming back in. I mean, we see this because we know that the statistics for divorce are, 50% and higher, and it's no better in the church, supposedly. The statistics say that it is outside the church. And I mean, I have thought so many times, even in the 35 years of my own marriage, like, it is really hard to stay married. Mm. There have been some times that I wanted to bolt my marriage so bad. And even one time, that is just a terrible thing to say, but one time I was like, if Paul were just dead, I could do this so much better without him. Like, that's just kind of that depth of just despair and that impact of sin, my sin, his sin, the sinners we were living with, the stressors of all the things going on. So I don't think we can just really underestimate how much sin has come and impacted those of us who are wanting to live in that good design, and those of us who are wanting to honor the Lord and to create a good marriage. It's still really, really, really hard.
I think what understanding the fall really helps us with is it helps us see that we don't just make mistakes today, is that sin has affected us wholly, like the way we think, the way we feel, the actions that, so sometimes we treat sin as like, an old road runner, like Acme, like a hole is covered with leaves and we fell in it. Like, I didn't see it coming. Like, I can't believe you showed up this way and I responded this way. Like, I had no choice but to respond this way. No, like, sin, all that we do today can be traced to the garden and that destruction of, in some ways of choosing against God's design. And then all of the tactics that we do today, they're just outworkings of the story in the fall.
Yeah, nothing's changed. Same old tactics, same old issues. So you think we'd have it down by now, but therein again lies the effects of the fall. It's not just about, I'm going to not do this and do this. There's so much underneath with desires and thinking and our will and all of those things. Well, Alex, let's turn our attention a little bit. We've been talking about how the fall has impacted the bigger story, the good design of God, but we've been also talking about this idea that we are made in God's image to reflect Him and to represent Him in the world. And then if we kind of narrow that down to marriage, we should be reflecting who God is within our marriage to our spouse, and that should be representing something about who He is to the world. But with the fall, we also have not just the distortion of God's good design, but the distortion of who we are as image bearers. Take us, I think if you and Adam could kind of walk us through like what has happened in these 4 areas or these 4 buckets, as Adam has called them, where our image bearing really begins to give expression, and then what are those distortions for us in the marriage relationship?
So just to remind us, the 4 areas are agency, purpose, belonging, and rest. And in agency, we're talking about the ability to make choices and act independently. And I see like 2 ditches that we fall in here with agency, where one ditch is the ditch of control, where we want to use our choices in order to take responsibility for what is not ours. We want to control our spouse, or we want to make our spouse in our image instead of into the image of God. And I think we see it it can come out in so many ways, constantly correcting and criticizing, micromanaging, pressuring our spouse to look or be or do certain things, and then even using sex as a weapon of control. We weaponize good things in our marriage in order to get the control that we want. And then the other ditch is this passivity. And it can seem like passivity may seemingly be a godly thing, but what we're talking about with passivity is avoiding the responsibility that's ours. So we don't want to be responsible for lovingly investing or engaging in the relationship, because it would require us to make choices that are choices of self-sacrifice. And so we see this played out in withdrawing or failure to initiate or engage in our God-given responsibilities. The place I probably see it the most is failing to initiate or engage in any kind of emotional intimacy, just withdrawing, not just leaving the room, but oftentimes staying in the room, but not really being there. And I also see it play out a lot in this kind of, we call it the game of chicken, where there becomes this standoff where both people withdraw to the point that they're both just waiting for the other one to be the one to make the sacrifice, the other one to be the one to change, and I'll change if she changes. And we call it that game of chicken, of just waiting for the other one to break. And so there are a lot of ways that we use our God-given ability to make choices to harm each other and to harm the relationship.
Very good. Those are some really great explanations. I like the ditch, the ditches we can fall in. So Adam, do you have some ditches for purpose that you can help us understand where we might go that would be keeping us in the fall?
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about, God has a design that for us to actually operate a certain way. So purpose, is this idea of living in God's design. So how the fall has touched it is that instead of seeking to what we say that enjoy God and glorify Him, we seek self. Like we purpose begins to be either self-centered or spouse-centered. And so the way it shows up with spouse-centered, if we start with that one, is like we look to our spouse as our role to give us meaning, direction, and significance. And really, in some ways, like I joke, as being an Enneagram 2, the mantra of an Enneagram is I'm okay if you're okay. And so sometimes we do that, is like we seek to like find our validation in the success of our marriage or in the satisfaction of our spouse, whether that's in getting affirmation back from them and trying to just do things so that we get something again back. We believe that if we can make somebody else happy, then maybe that will help us cover our own shame, our own sense of not measuring up. Another way is like it feels a desire to be needed or valued. That's a little bit of that Enneagram language I talked about. Or the fear of losing the relationship. That one of the attacks of the fall is that relationships feel unsafe. And as we see Adam and Eve like bolt for the bushes, we wonder at times, if I do this, will they bolt? Will they finally say that's enough? Like you said earlier, Brenda, if we actually act on the thought of like, maybe life would be easier without him. And so really sin's distortion is thinking that I've got to do whatever to keep them in this. And our purpose has lost sight. And really in light of that, it's a misunderstanding of biblical roles. Then instead of thinking of how to complement the other and being that, helpmate and that good contending with and a contending against for the sake of the other, it's sometimes cheap peace. Like my role is just to lay down. I think I'll use like the image of a doormat or and so that begins to be part of it. You structure your whole life around your spouse's needs, preferences, their success, and again you lose your sense of self and you lose your sense of calling. And that's a really big deal. Like sometimes you hear people say it like, I don't know who I am anymore. That's the language of like, I've gotten absorbed into my spouse. Sin's distortion is my identity is rooted in my spouse, not in me being an image bearer in relationship with God. And so, part of that may be losing your voice. Like I don't feel like I have a sense to say anything or to have a difference of opinion, or there's no view for your own growth. The other ditch is it's all you. It's, it is planet you and everything's revolving around you. And so we want to find our purpose away from our spouse. This happens sometimes when people have hobbies that so consume them, it takes them out and are unwilling to hear the voice of their others in the ways that they might say like, hey, I think you've missed me in this. I mentioned one of the hard things for us was just relational, like communication. And one of the places it most showed up was me being in ministry. I kind of turned to ministry for some emotional fulfillment of being needed in people's lives and then not being able to hear the voice of my wife saying like, I need you and I miss you in this. And so even something as good as ministry distorted my view of purpose in marriage. And it was really self-seeking. And so then marriage needed to fit my pursuit of ministry even. So that can be so harmful for our spouse. So we prioritize our individual goals or ambitions, or maybe we become so driven by a personal need for success that we forget the purposes God has for us, not just as individuals, but as a couple. And we talk about shared purpose, shared meaning. This is like not even on the table at this point. It's when that's not even a concern. And so maybe that's some of your biggest life decisions, like a job without consulting your spouse, taking on something new, or saying, we're just going to move to this city. It's like, wait a minute, like that feels like a conversation we could have had, or the thousands of implications of this.
Yeah, that's so good. Alex, we had talked a little bit about just there's a little bit of a nuancing between purpose and belongings, but there's also going to be a lot of crossover. So how do you think the fall has touched belonging?
So it's going to sound, like you said, very similar because these do overlap, and that belonging is that need for community, for intimate relationship with God and others. And so we see it play out in two different ways. The fall affects it through enmeshment, again, like Adam said, where we lose our sense of self. I think with purpose, we lose our voice and our calling. But with enmeshment, we lose a sense of self in that we give the power to the other person of defining, like, if we're okay, like Adam said, emotionally okay. And we may so structure our lives around our spouse that we fail to cultivate our relationship with God or our relationship with others, because our spouse's approval is what we're really living for. And I think this can take place on a continuum from, people pleasing, where we overly want to please our spouse, but then you see it in very destructive relationships where addiction and abuse are happening, and someone has completely lost their ability to be a person because the addiction or the abuse has now taken over the marriage. And then
And I think,
yeah.
Alex, I was just going to say the term that we most often hear for that is codependent.
Yeah, codependent.
And that would be enmeshment.
Enmeshment is codependence. And in both of these, in purpose and belonging, we're losing a sense of self. I think the distinction we're making is that with purpose, we're losing a sense of calling, of who we are, why we're here. In belonging, we're losing a sense of pleasing God, and now we want to only please our spouse above all else. And then the other ditch would be detachment from our spouse, where we completely don't want to or fail to cultivate a relationship with our spouse because we want to find belonging and approval in others. So the famous verse on marriage is, a man will leave his father and cleave to his wife. And so what we see a lot of times is this failure to leave or cleave, where we prioritize our family above our spouse. We want their approval. We want their validation. Or maybe it's we want our friends or even our children are people who we detach from our spouse to only get that sense of belonging and intimacy with other people who are not our spouse.
Great. I think that was a great explanation. Thank you. Adam, let's move on to the last one, and the distortion of rest and beauty in the fall. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the ability to create and enjoy peace in shalom, that wholeness. And so in one sense, fall's distortion is where we don't actually get to experience any rest or any beauty. And so we live as if we're infinite, like we live with we leave no margin for rest or beauty in our life. And so, this might be structuring our life with high activity. Again, going back to the idea of like enmeshment in a relationship, like we drive our spouses beyond their limits, requiring the family to take on too many responsibilities. So either as a seeking to please kind of the ideal of something, or even seeking to please self, but it's not leaving space for beauty, or even thinking maybe it's an ideal to value in marriage. I think as a pastor, this is one that feels very pertinent because we're in a culture that is highly mobile, and if you don't say like where your limits are, then everybody else will. Everybody else will set your schedule for you, and so not leaving that rest or capacity for rest or beauty, we get overcommitted. We're always rushing. There's little time to be together. And then when we're together, there's little time of enjoyment. And even going back to that idea of belonging, one of the threats of the fall is the sense that I can be enjoyed. I can be delighted in. And so then the other aspect of it is not just like having no space for it, but then is counterfeit beauties or counterfeit rest. Yeah. Where we lose the ability or willingness to notice, receive, or even cultivate what is good. This comes for settling for shallow distractions or emotional disengagement. So in some ways, we see a lot of presentations of marriage and relationship on TV, and so we settle for a lot of like what real beauty in marriage ought to be. And so perhaps we don't spend the time to really cultivate what would be good and beautiful in our marriages. Instead, we settle for what's fast, what's easy, what feels like it's not going to be costly to me. One of the first things you said today is like to really like make marriage work, and our dependency upon the Lord actually does require effort and requires repentance and requires a vulnerability that at times means like, what happens if this doesn't go the way I think it will? And so, that idea of counterfeit rest and beauty is that we're not very intentional. We start giving up, and we start doing maybe very cliche things like, well, I bought you this, or, we went on that one date, a couple months ago, like, what else could you ask for? So we begin to not only lower a bar, but we, again, don't think of what actually would move towards the heart of the other. So
I love that you included the counterfeit rest and beauty, because I think that that's something we don't consider a lot, but it's very, very available to us in our culture, where we think, we're doom scrolling and we actually think this is rest. I mean, there's so many studies showing now that it's not resting people. Or, just I think the way there's so much information coming at us, there's so much noise on the outside, soul noise on the inside. Goodness, I don't know what I would do if I was growing up in this day and age, because there's too many choices for everything. Yeah. There's so much information about everything. It just feels very overwhelming. So it doesn't even allow for rest. And then when you're trying to escape to rest, I'm going to binge watch a Netflix show, or, just kind of the escapism that we can, like we see escapism as being rest, but there's really, there's not the beauty of that or the rest in those things that God has for us. So I think we have to be very wise and discerning, and even, intentional. Yeah. And really, what is rest and beauty going to look like in our lives and in our marriages?
One of the things I wanted to say is, in a similar way that, like, if we go back to that idea that God is reorienting his people to a different story than the story they're coming out of, and the people of Egypt coming out of slavery and finding their value and their productivity, and the narrative of creation is rest. Like, in some ways, we adopt these really weird views of marriage at times and relating together, where, hey, if we just do all this stuff, or if we orient towards our kids for the next 18 years, like, we can get to a place of rest one day, or we can get to a place where then we can earn, like, what we're supposed to be experiencing in marriage, when really, like, setting limits and honoring those limits allows us to experience the very design that God has for us. But again, it's that question of what's driving my view of how I'm supposed to relate to my spouse, and what's feeding that if we were to go through each of these, like, what's the assault on my agency, what's the assault on belonging and purpose and rest and beauty.
I think that's so good. And I want to say, we're giving the two ditches. There's a continuum. You may not be all controlling or all passive, but you're going to lean one side to the other. And as we've gone through these, I just realized, like, Paul and I, and of course where we've grown is different, but I can just see, like, in every one of these areas, one of us leans strongly toward one side of the ditch. Maybe we weren't in the ditch. I think at a time or two we may have actually been in some of these ditches, just straight in the ditches, but the leaning, like, one side or the other side. And so for us, we're very polarized in that. And when that happens, there's just going to be a lot of conflict. There's going to be a lot of misunderstanding. There's going to be a lot of disappointment. There's going to be a lot of hurt and pain. And if you continue in that direction over time, you are not going to end up in a good place, and you are not going to end up with a beautiful relationship, or a good friendship, or a good relationship. So I think this is, like you said, it's a great litmus, if you will, to kind of go back and say, which way do I lean? Again, you may not fall in the ditch, but where do I lean? And so what we're going to do in the next episode is talk about redemption, and we're going to talk about, how does the gospel correct your leanings? Like, how do you get back to that good place, that good design that God has? But Alex, we're giving tools for each of these, and you've got a tool that you will record and release separate from this talk. Can you tell us a little bit about the tool?
Well, there are actually two tools for this.
Oh, excellent.
Because the fall is so pervasive.
Right.
The first one is learning how to take a pause when we're outside of our window of tolerance, which sounds, even when I explain it to people, I think that they think it's really maybe even silly or simplistic, but it is oftentimes, what people come back to me and tell me has changed their communication and their conflict resolution more than anything. And so I think it's a very important tool. And then the other tool is called relational trends, probably more aptly relational patterns. But it's within conflict, we tend to have a way that we handle conflict, move towards, move away, or move against. And we begin to see that each marriage has a dance when we're in conflict, and we talk about how do we identify that dance, and then how do we work against it. And these are probably my two favorite tools for conflict resolution. And I think when we did the marriage conference, these are the tools we got the most feedback on as being the most helpful ones that we gave.
That's great. Well, we'll look forward. I think the tools, I've heard you explain the tools at the conference, and you did such a great job, and they are very usable. All the tools are very usable. So I hope that our listeners will take the time to listen to those and then really take the time to implement them, because we don't just need to be hearers of the word, but doers. It does take effort. It takes effort to have the good marriages we want to have, and it takes our effort and of course so much of God's grace. And that's what we're going to be talking about in episode 4, is how does redemption in a sense undo the fall. We know that the penalty of sin is broken when we're saved as individuals, and the power of sin is we're able to overcome as individuals. And so how does that look? How do we approach our marriages? How are we going to be transformed? How are we going to make repair? How are we going to get to the good stuff that God has for us? And we can't do that apart from Jesus and the redemption and the sanctification and all the things that just come from the whole story of the scripture, as Jesus as the center and the hero of the story. So we're looking forward to episode 4. Please don't stop here. I keep saying that. Please go with us the whole journey, because there's so much hope on the other side of this podcast.
Yeah. Can I say one last thing with the fall?
Sure.
I just think like we do sometimes want to fly right past, like we know things are bad, but we don't really want to look at it, because sometimes we're really afraid to see or to wrestle with what we might actually see. Mm-hmm. And the fall really does help us recognize, like, you're not extra broken, you're human, affected by the fall. And so there's a great hope to realize, like, my marriage may feel very different than somebody else's, but the fall helps us understand, like, it's not a mystery. Like, there's some really sin and suffering happening, and there's a grace to be able to be honest about that, because it's in recognizing the trueness of what's broken to recognize the true healing in Christ's redemption. And so there is this element that sometimes we think, like, talking about the fall as being like negative or being Debbie Downer, but like there is this grace to just name, like, I have limits and they've been affected by the fall, and I'm not loving the way I ought, but I'm not extra broken. There's very particular ways I might be struggling today, and so there's a grace to really reckon with the story.
I love that, Adam. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so hopeful and encouraging. Well, guys, we're going to wrap this up, and we will see you next time.